Today we are plagued by horrid visions filtered through a young and fragile mind. A story of tragedy upon tragedy as seen in that simplistic, innocent, and unknowing vision. And we are plagued also by the realization that perhaps there are lives that can never know an ounce of happiness or hope. Hi, and welcome to another installment of Plagued by Visions, where we explore literature that's just a fucking bummer, man. My name is Juan, and before I get started, I just want to reiterate what I've said already in the past. In the last video that I made, which was on some hate speech experiences that I've had while making videos here on BookTube, the reception for that video has been overwhelmingly positive, to a point that I didn't know was possible. And I just wanted to reiterate and say thank you to all of you for being such kind, wonderful, and understanding people, and for really showing me that for just an ounce of hate that might fall upon my channel, there's tons and tons of love and support just waiting to pour out and just drown it and do away with it. And it's just amazing, and I really truly feel welcomed here, and it is thanks to you all. So I just wanted to say once more, thank you, all of you, for all the kind words that have been said and continue to be said on that video. It truly means so much to me. And now let's get on to the review that I have for you today. I am going to be reviewing The Butcher Boy by Patrick McCabe. This is an Irish novel that was first published in 1992, the year I was born. Just randomly throw that in there. And I also wanted to say thank you to Seamus Gaelic, who is the lovely viewer, the lovely individual that recommended this to me. I'm going to put their comment up here. This is a literary fiction novel. So it's not horror. It's not one of those books that are intending to pile shock upon shock and viscera and all kinds of extremes. It's not that kind of disturbing work. This is meant to be read more as a, what you would call it, I don't think it's autobiographic, but it's meant to read as a social realism. It's meant to read as something within the realm of reality and within the realm of a more literary narrative that's sort of drawn away from some of the constraints and aesthetics that we're used to seeing in my most disturbing books list. And I appreciate that, because I do think that we can find disturbing works anywhere within literature. I mean, some of these romance novels are extremely questionable in nature, so same for comedy. So I always appreciate finding disturbing works in the most unexpected of places. And this, although it is not horror, although it is not extreme fiction or splatterpunk or anything like that, this is truly one of the most disturbing books that I have read in recent memory. And it tends to be the case with a lot of this more literary fiction that nonetheless packs so much disturbing subject matter into its narrative, because there's something about that which is only incidentally disturbing, something that's not purposely trying to shock or upset, but just given the circumstances of the subject matter that it's exploring, it just turns out to be that way. That circumstantial, disturbing nature is often what gets me the most, and that's what we find here. Now, I want to say this was not a perfect 5-star read for me, but it was close. And I just want to stipulate here at the beginning that that may very well be just out of personal reasons. I may be a little bit burnt out on this misery lit of this kind. This is a story of a young Irish boy named Francie who grows up in just the most derelict and harsh and unforgiving and unloving and monstrous circumstances imaginable. And every step of the way throughout his childhood and adolescence is plagued by just the most rancid of occurrences and interpersonal relationships, And it's that kind of like misery lit that's become a hot topic. Like what are we really reading when we read a work that's just meant to pile misery upon misery, and meant to sort of even titillate a little bit, or really try to get at our empathic muscles in a way that's not so much significant as it is just indulgent, or just not sensible. It's just kind of like, here's some misery for you so you can feel something and feel better about your privileged life, that kind of thing. I wouldn't describe this book as being such a thing. I do think that there are things in here that are quite sensible and important and impactful. And for me, that makes the difference between something that's just exploitative and horrific for the sake of making you go, oh, and that's it. That there's a lot in here that will grip you and not let you go. And when you disturb even the very comfort of a more privileged vantage point from which you are reading, when something reaches out from the pages and rattles your foundation, I think that is significant, important, and not necessarily exploitative. But I can see it being categorized as misery lit. So it's iffy. And so what I'm trying to get at, I don't know why I'm rambling. I guess I'm a little rusty. I haven't made a video in a couple of days, but what I'm trying to get at is that I've been reading a lot of books like that. I'm a little bit burnt out of misery lit, and so coming into this, it just felt overwhelming, and at the same time underwhelming. Overwhelming in the sense that it's rife with horrificness, it's rife with injustice and violence and transgressive thought upon transgressive thought, but at the same time underwhelmed in the sense that I was just like, oh, like it's just more of the same again and again, like from other things that I've been reading as of late. And so I'm saying those are the psychological factors that are brewing in my mind right now, and that's probably not the top form that with which I could have approached a book like this. Maybe I needed to take a break in between titles, a longer break. I don't know, but that's what kind of kept me from going, oh wow, that was a 5-star read. It was just I guess, yeah, I'm a little bit exhausted, but it's still very good, very significant book, and I'm really, really happy I read it. So like I said, this involves the story of Francie, who is a young Irish boy who comes from a working class family, and everything you can imagine. He lives in a pretty dysfunctional family that's very in a very delicate state of that moment in which it's about to fall apart. Everything is very fragile and unstable. His mother is suicidal. His father is sort of resentful of the harsh circumstances in which they are forced to live, and he sort of emotionally takes that grief out on his wife and his son, Francie. The relationships that Francie strikes with other boys that surround him are, in that childish glee of like ever so frivolous and not really too sentimental or anything of the sort, but at the same time, that's kind of what makes him even more monstrous, in that Francie, for the most part, is a passive observer, and everything that we get in the story is filtered through his mind, and his mind, of course, from coming from such a dysfunctional family and having so few scruples of his own because of the way that he's been raised, because of the way that he's been sort of compelled to go about life in order to survive and protect himself. Everything is told from a certain level of detachment, makes this a sort of really unique experience in the way in which we experience the narrative. So for example, there's a lot of dialogue in here from other characters, but it is told through, of course, the filtered reality of Francie's mind. And most of the dialogue that we get from other characters is not told in quotations, but rather in italics. And our reading muscles, when it comes to italics tend to represent the inner thoughts of a character. And so even the different perspectives that we get from other characters seem to only be another factor of every single thought that's brewing passively in Francie's mind. And so everything sort of feels very disjointed from reality in that sense. And there's a lot of uses of these various experimental narrative forms. There's also a long running thoughts. It's very much told in a sort of stream of consciousness way. There's glimpses and images that sort of do feel readable, but in a sense also feel like it's much more of an amalgam of different thoughts and images rather than one progressive and continuous narrative. It's very disconcerting in that sense, and I think that just piles onto the overall feeling of disturbingness that we have going on here. And there's just everything, there's a violation of friendships, of family bonds, of motherly love. Everything just sort of falls apart as we go on and on throughout the narrative. And there's just something about Irish literature specifically that while reading this, I sort of realized for the first time, thinking back to like the truly transgressive at the time subject matter that Oscar Wilde would undertake in narratives like The Picture of Dorian Gray, to the absolutely rebellious and non-conforming wartime poetry of W.B. Yeats, to the absolute affronts to the tradition of literary narrative of works like James Joyce, to the even more experimental uses of interiority and surreal, almost absurdist narratives of Samuel Beckett. And now arriving at this, and there's even more that I failed to mention, but it's just now that I realize Irish literature is really like one of my favorite regional literatures of all time. And there's a lot about Irish literature that when I read it, I sort of instinctively compare it to Mexican literature, and I feel like there's a lot of ways in which the two meet. I mean, even historically, historically, Ireland and Mexico have crossed paths and more than once in terms of immigration and the sharing of cultures. There's a lot of Irish influence in some regions of Mexico, but also just in terms of a history of, for instance, a colonialism that historians sort of even adamantly refuse to recognize as colonialism in terms of the relationship between Mexico and the US, sort of very significantly paralleling the relationship between Ireland and the United Kingdom. And so also in terms of narrative and its use of a much darker, a grittier, and a much more monstrous sense of place and of that horrifying influence that place has on the psychology of characters. I see a lot of those similarities also between Mexican and Irish literature. So it's a very fascinating stuff, and Irish literature is truly some of the most powerful and potent that I have ever encountered, and this was no exception at all. In fact, I would even call this one of the best books that I have read so far this year. And also just the constant piling on of misery that we find in here. What really saved and even elevated the narrative for me at that point, which would have probably made me put away any other book, was just how compelling the voice is here. And that is something that Irish authors do masterfully as well, is that they have a sense of voice unlike any other. And the voice here is, like I said, passive, it's observant, and it's also quite humorous. And I found that to be particularly impactful and compelling, because there's just absolutely nothing humorous about the subject matter that's being explored here. But nonetheless, you find it here in the narrative. You find it in the way that Francie is sort of forced to look at his reality, and the way that he's sort of forced to look at the relationships that he has with the Nugents, who are this neighboring family that really despise Francie's family because they see him as these low-life and lazy and really monstrous people. And there's a lot of sort of banter between the two families. There's a lot of banter between Francie and pretty much anybody he encounters, and you feel like that's a defense mechanism for Francie and for the reader, perhaps because sometimes we just have to laugh out of that nervousness and out of that anxiety that's slowly escalating more and more the more we go through this. And the journey of Francie from a dysfunctional family to being institutionalized, to having to experience all kinds of things like suicide, like hatred, just deep societal and familial hatred, having to experience molestation, which is, as you know, it's a subject matter that I really struggle reading sometimes. But here, I think it's also very compelling because the voice that's telling the story is so gripping. It demands to be heard and it demands to be noticed in its uniqueness and prowess, and that sort of makes it even more disturbing because it's the narrative that grips you, but with this really like grimy and slimy grasp that you just feel kind of dirty after reading some of the things that you read in here. But nonetheless, you have to keep going. The more that Francie's mind sort of deteriorates and leans towards the side of deviancy, it just becomes quite shocking, unpalatable beyond belief. But again, it compels you to keep reading. And when an author can grab a hold of your psyche like that, and then sort of like peeling your eyes open and demanding that you look at the stuff that they're writing about, even if you don't want to, that makes for some extremely dangerous but also masterful reading that I just cannot ignore. And even if, you know, I'm coming from that place of exhaustion of like, can I read a happy book for once in my fucking life? Even then, I found myself sort of burning through this book and just being absolutely engrossed in the story that I was witnessing. It was fantastic. And I ended up giving this 4.5 stars out of 5, just kind of as a cop out, just because it's not something, again, that I would ever read again. And my default for books like that, for like, okay, this book was absolutely horrific and monstrous, I would never read it again, but it was masterful. My default rating for books of that kind tends to be 3 stars out of 5. Whereas, like, if you can stomach it, I recommend it. But if not, steer away. And I certainly wouldn't pick it up again. But this was different. This was much more masterful than that, much more compelling than that. And so I feel like it falls short of a 5-star rating for me personally, because to me 5-star ratings are something that I would like to revisit, that I would like to say, you know, there's some merit here that I want to recognize and sort of assimilate it as a favorite of mine, and something that I would like to revisit at different points of my life. I don't know if I'll ever read this again. Just because of how deeply upsetting it was. But still, I have to recognize merit where it bears recognizing. And here I see an extremely powerful novel that if you can stomach it, you should go ahead and read it. It has my recommendation behind it, but it's just that I'm never gonna want to revisit this again. But never say never, right? Maybe I'm just at a mental state right now where I'm like, I'm good. But further down the line, you never know what's going to happen, right? But no, this was incredible. This has won several awards, or at least been nominated for some awards, shortlisted for the 1992 Booker Prize. So it was very recognized at the time that it was published, and rightfully so. I would say it certainly deserves to be awarded in some way, but I had never heard of it. But I'm so glad Seamus, my viewer again, brought it to my attention, and I'm happy I read it. I don't regret reading it. I thought it was a masterful work of compelling voice and really sort of a experimental and different narrative storytelling techniques that were compelling and monstrous and deeply upsetting and everything else in between. But it's a masterful novel, and the Irish really tend to put out some masterful novels when they set their mind to it. So absolutely, 100%. If you're into the more disturbing, unsavory corners of literature, which if you're here, you probably are, keep in mind, like I said, it's not a horror novel, or it's not that kind of aesthetic. It reads much differently. It is much more literary in that sense, and that But nonetheless, if you can keep up with it, and if you can, roll with the punches, and if you're not too upset by being so monstrously gripped by a narrative, I say definitely give this a try. So that is my review for The Butcher Boy by Patrick McCabe. Again, thank you so much to my viewer Seamus for recommending it to me. I absolutely loved it. Again, thank you all so much for all of your wonderful comments and all of your support. That really means the world to me. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you've read this book, or let me know if you're interested in it. Let me know, what are your thoughts on Misery Lit? What are the merits of having a narrative that's just piling tragedy upon tragedy? Do you think it's exploitative by default? Do you think that we should push ourselves to read narratives of this kind that are just tragedy upon tragedy? And if so, where's the limit for you? Where do you think something crosses the line between being significant and being exploitative, if you even draw a line like that at all? And of course, narratives of this sort sometimes also bleed into just the unrealistic. That was one of the problems that I had with the novel Push by Sapphire, where I just kind of felt like, okay, this has reached a level of tragedy that's just absurd. Something like Titus Andronicus, So there's definitely some limits. There's definitely some borders, and some narratives tend to cross them for the better or for the worse. So I would want to hear your thoughts on literature of that kind, if you've been exposed to anything like that. All right, thank you for watching. Continue to stay safe. I hope everyone is doing very well, and I will be back with another review, something lighter this time around. It's one of the books right here. I'm not gonna tell you which one, but it's here. You go ahead and guess. All right, I will see you all later, and everybody keep reading.